I want to welcome you to the second Tocqueville event of the 2024 academic year. My name is Brent Nelson, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. I hope you received one of these brochures at the door. It contains the schedule of topics and speakers for the year, and I think you will agree that we have an extraordinary lineup this year. We like to think we bring important thinkers to address critical topics. And this is what the Tocqueville Center does. We try to ask big questions at the heart of political life, often, but not always, the same questions that Alexis de Tocqueville himself asked about the budding democracy he saw growing on the North American continent in the early 19th century. We address these questions from a variety of angles and perspectives by drawing deeply on the great minds of the past and the present. And then we talk. The Tocqueville Fellows, who you see scattered around, some are ushers, some are just sitting out in the area, they've committed themselves to a whole year of talking about these ideas. The Tocqueville Fellows will for sure discuss at some length the ideas we will hear over the next 2 evenings. But we also hope most of you will go away from here better informed, but also perhaps curious about what you still don't know, and eager to talk to people about what it all means for us and for our society. We want the conversation that you start here to continue on your dorm floors and in your apartments and with your parents at Thanksgiving. Ooh, well, okay, maybe not that. Depends on the political orientation of your parents and you. Anyway, so we all know we live in a closely divided country. I have come to realize that a 50-50 electorate seems quite dangerous for any democracy. And that's my personal opinion, but that's why I'm nervous. We as a country, we've agreed that elections decide the big questions in America. Elections these days are important, maybe more important than they've ever been. But never before has in our country's history, has the integrity of our elections been questioned as they have been in the last 4 years. We believe that government should be legitimated by the consent of the people. But what if we cannot determine what the people want? What if we doubt our ability to measure the direction of its consent? Then, in the immortal words of John Locke, we're screwed. Didn't he say that? Oh, okay, maybe that was apocryphal, sorry. To help us understand our electoral moment and perhaps help calm our fears, we are very fortunate to have with us 2 analysts of American elections, particularly its legislative elections, Erin Covey and Jessica Taylor. Later, we will add to our band of experts Rui Teixeira and Danielle Vinson, who will join us for our panel discussion. But first, we will hear from our featured speakers. I will introduce both of them now and then let them follow each other without interruption. So Erin Covey analyzes the U.S. House of Representatives for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. And if you've ever watched NewsHour on PBS, which I'm sure all of you are devotees of, you will see Amy Walter of the Cook Report with Amy Walter giving analysis every Monday on NewsHour. So it's a big deal to be associated with the Cook Report. So Erin earned her BA from Liberty University, where she studied journalism and English and was a news editor at the school paper. Covey has worked extensively as a reporter and analyst with a variety of national publications. She is a contributing author for the 2024 Almanac of American Politics and was a co-host of the Inside Elections podcast. And you can read the rest of her biography in the brochure. Jessica Taylor is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. She graduated from Furman in 2007 with a BA in political science, and at Furman, she is a member of the alumni board. She is the first female senior author for the Almanac of American Politics in the book's 50-year history, a role she held for both the 2022 and 2024 editions. Jessica also reported for or has been called on as an analyst for a wide range of national media outlets, which are detailed in the brochure. But I want to give her a special shout out for appearing just over a week ago on PBS's Washington Week, which is probably the most prestigious gig for a political reporter that you can get. Congratulations, Jessica. And I am enough of a politics geek to admit that I spend my Friday nights watching Washington Week. So that just tells you how far down you have to go to be a political scientist. No, I love the show. Now, without further ado, please welcome Erin Covey. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for that intro. I'm really excited to be here. I have driven through Greenville a couple of times, but have never been to Furman, and y'all have a beautiful campus, so excited for the next couple of days here. So my specialty is the House, but I'm going to talk about the presidential race a little bit just because it determines so much of what happens in the House. And it's a little bit boring because we just keep saying over and over again that it's a toss-up, which it kind of is. I promise I'm not BSing you. I think I just checked the 538 average a couple of minutes ago, and currently Harris and Trump are tied in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and in Nevada on average, and Trump has a narrow lead in Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia, and that is within the margin of error. So effectively, all 7 of these states that are going to determine who controls the White House in 2025 are tied right now. Now, over the past couple of weeks, Trump has made some slight gains in polls in the crucial state of Pennsylvania. So there's been a little bit of unrest and stress in Democratic circles about that, but still, at the end of the day, we do believe this race is quite close and could go either way. So I'm going to go ahead actually and skip ahead to our national polling average that we released this year. There are a lot of polling averages floating around on the internet. I'll tout ours by saying that we use a little bit more of a selective group of pollsters. So these are really high quality pollsters that we believe their methodology is sound. So you're not getting junk polls in there that are maybe disrupting the average a bit. So currently, on the national level, Harris has a 2-point lead in our national polling average. You'll remember that in 2020, Biden led the popular vote by 4 points. Now, of course, the popular vote is not how we decide control of the White House in America. So this is just more helpful in terms of looking at overall the national political environment and what we're seeing. So currently, it is a little bit worse than what Biden's margin was at. In 2020, but Harris still has a slight lead. And you'll see also at the bottom of the screen, it's a little bit small, so I apologize for that. But you can compare how the crosstabs of these polls show Harris and Trump are doing with respective demographic groups. And I'll point out a couple that are interesting to note relative to where we saw these numbers in 2020. You'll see that Trump looks like he is on pace to make gains among Hispanic voters, and then also black voters to a certain extent. And you'll also see, and I don't have the 2020 numbers pulled up, but looking at the data from 2020, it looks like the gender gap is going to widen a little bit and become more comparable to what we saw in 2016. And that's in particular because the gender gap has widened among young voters, among Hispanic voters, and among black voters. And so going back to our House ratings, the House is also a toss-up. Currently, Republicans have a 4-point or a 4-seat majority in the House, an incredibly narrow one, and we saw what that looked like over the past 2 years. It was very difficult for anything to get done. A speaker was ousted. I don't think we're going to be headed away from that chaos anytime soon, because if you look at the House battleground, neither party is favored in enough seats to win a strong majority. And so we do believe that no matter who wins the majority at the end of the day in the House, it'll be another slim majority. And that will probably lead to a lot more gridlock and infighting, regardless of who is in control. But I will say, I'm not going to go through all of these races just because there are so many. There's a couple dozen races that we have as pure toss-ups. So setting those aside, if you do the math and you look at our ratings, looking at the ones that are solid Democrat, likely Democrat, and lean Democrat, we have Democrats favored in 202 seats. On the Republican side, we have Republicans favored in 206 seats. So again, very narrow, neither party has a clear edge. And then currently we have 27 seats in our toss-up category. That category vacillates a bit. I still might move some ratings in the next in the next 2 weeks. So that number may change, but I think both parties are kind of on the same page about the House battleground itself being relatively small. A couple of decades ago, there were a lot more competitive House seats. We used to have really full toss-up columns if you go back to our ratings from the 80s and the 90s. But as we have entered a more hyper-polarized era, the number of competitive House races has shrunk over time. And that's for a variety of reasons. Some of it is gerrymandering, some of it is geographic sorting, and I won't bore you with all the details of that. But it is safe to say that the number of competitive districts in the House has really shrunk a lot over time. And as that has happened, the number of voters who are splitting their ballots has also shrunk. So in 2020, there were only 16 congressional districts that voted one way at the congressional level and the opposite way at the presidential level. And that's why the presidential race is so important when we're looking at control of the House in 2025. And so how Harris and Trump do in all of these toss-up districts and in our lean and likely districts as well is going to determine to a certain extent whether or not folks will be able to win re-election. And so you'll also see there are some interesting geographic trends with the House this cycle. And I'm going to back up a little bit to 2022 to explain why some of this is the case. So in 2022, this was an interesting midterm cycle. Going in, the conventional wisdom was that Republicans would do well because in a midterm cycle, the party out of control typically picks up seats. But that was not really the case. We didn't see a red wave. Instead, we saw a red wave in specific states that maybe were more responsive to what was happening in those states and with the governors of those states and leadership of those states rather than the national environment as a whole. And then we also saw Democrats do quite well in other states. So we saw a blue wave in certain places. And some of that was in response to the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. That mobilized Democratic and independent voters, particularly in purple and red states, where access to abortion was now under threat in a way that it wasn't before. So we saw Republicans do particularly well in the blue states of California and New York, and then they also made some gains in places like New Jersey and in Oregon. And so now you have Republicans defending seats largely in blue territory. So I'm going to flip back to our ratings page, and you'll see in the Republican toss-up category, we have 5 seats in California. These are all held by Republicans. 3 seats in New York, 1 in Oregon, and then the couple of other states that are left, or the couple of other districts that are left, are in red or purple states. But the bulk of that column is in blue states. So Republicans' path to holding the House is going to depend on them being able to hold on to control of these blue districts, most of which Biden won by a decent margin in 2020. Now, what may be their saving grace is that if Harris does not reach Biden's margin in some of these districts, it'll be less difficult for these Republican members to win re-election. They're probably going to have to overperform Trump in a lot of these places to begin with, but by how much they have to overperform Trump could determine their prospects. And then you'll see on the Democratic side, a lot of their territory is in swingier places. So we have a couple of seats in Pennsylvania, for example, that they're holding that are quite vulnerable, or in Michigan, or North Carolina. And so their prospects are also tied to the top of the ticket, and even more so in the swing states where the presidential race is dominating the airwaves, and voters are even further tying the presidential race to the House races and the candidates as well. So all in all, it is quite competitive, and I do think there's a lot of talk about the current members who represent crossover districts. So those are districts that voted the opposite way in 2020 as the member who represents them. Currently, you have 16 Republicans who represent seats that Biden won in 2020, and you have 5 Democrats who represent seats that Trump won in 2020. So the conventional wisdom is kind of that these members are going to be the most vulnerable. I think that's largely the case, though it may vary a little bit because it's not clear exactly what the presidential margin is going to be in 2024. And in certain places, like parts of New York, like Long Island, it looks like these places are moving away towards Democrats as a whole, which would impact Republicans' prospects for holding them. At the same time, we're seeing Democrats are making surprising gains in places like Iowa and in Nebraska, which could boost their prospects in those states. So it's kind of reverting against maybe how you would expect states to trend. Iowa has largely trended away from Democrats, as we all know, for the last several years, but there's some indication that Harris may actually do a little bit better than Biden did in 2020. So the fun thing about the House is that you can kind of pick up on some of these more regional trends before they show up at the national level. But then I'm going to go ahead and point out a couple of specific races in the toss-up column that are really interesting to watch and could be determinative. But I'm happy to take any questions about any of these races or even ones that are not on our list right now if you have specific House races that you really want to go deep on. So a couple of races that could be determinative this cycle are Alaska's race. So currently Mary Peltola is a Democrat. She represents the at-large seat in Alaska. That just means that this is a seat that takes up the whole state. And she's running in a state that Trump won by 10 points in 2020. So she's in a really difficult position. Now, Alaska has a unique ranked choice voting system, which has protected her to a certain extent and made it a little bit easier for a Democrat to win in a red state, but she is still in a quite difficult position. And I think most Republicans believe that she is one of the most vulnerable Democrats and one of the seats that they are in a decent position to pick up this cycle. Another one that I would put in that column is Michigan's 7th district, which is an open seat, and it's open because the current Democratic incumbent there, Alyssa Slotkin, is running for the Senate race. That's great for the Senate race because she is a really strong fundraiser and a strong campaigner who has been able to outperform in a lot of her competitive races, but it's tougher for the House race because now she's leaving open a seat that is really evenly divided. Biden won it by about a point in 2020 and could flip to Republicans. And that's another one that we think could maybe flip. We still have it in the toss-up column. The Republican seat that is probably most likely to flip, on the other hand, is New York's 22nd district. You'll see that that's the only Republican-held seat that we have in a lean Democrat column. So he clearly is going to be the most vulnerable Republican incumbent up for re-election this cycle. That's a seat in upstate New York, and he's running in a district that Biden now would have won by 11 points. And then on the Republican side, other vulnerable members that we're paying close attention to are John Duarte in California's 13th district, that's in the Central Valley, David Valadao, also in California's Central Valley in the 22nd district, and then Mike Garcia, who is in the northern part of LA County. And then further, we also have a lot of really interesting races in New York this cycle, and that includes Mike Lawler, who's representing the Hudson Valley, and Anthony D'Esposito, who's representing Long Island. Those are both districts that Biden won by double digits in 2020, so they should theoretically be really difficult seats for a Republican to win in. However, we have seen in polls that it looks like Harris is making, or is losing their relative, not losing the districts, but is underperforming relative to where Biden was in 2020 there. So all in all, it's a really tight battleground. And typically from what we have seen in previous years, the House falls the same way as the presidential. So probably the most likely outcome is whoever wins the White House is the party that controls the House in 2025. However, because these margins are so close, and because whoever controls the House is probably going to have a really slim majority, it's also conceivable that we could see Harris win the White House and Republicans retain control of the House. Which, if they're likely to control the Senate, that could lead to a tense environment next year. But we could also see the reverse scenario, where Trump wins the White House and Democrats manage to take back the House. So it seems off, but because the margins are so close, we do believe that those are all possibilities. So on election night, we're probably not going to know who controls the House, unfortunately. And that's in large part because we have all these seats on the West Coast, first of all, so they get their returns in later in the night. But we also have states that take a while to count their ballots, notably California. And so we're probably not going to know who controls the House for days, if not weeks. Hopefully we'll know the presidential race sooner than that, and hopefully we'll have clues about who might be closer to controlling the House. But we don't expect to know results for a while. So it's going to be a long couple of days. And I do think there's probably not much time for either party to gain a clear edge in the House at this point, and we do believe it is truly a toss-up. If you do the math and you divide the number of seats in toss-up and add them to the number of seats that each party is favored in, it does look like Republicans have a slight edge right now in controlling the House. But it's really the slightest of edges, so I hesitate to even say that. But I'll go ahead and transfer to Jessica now, and she can talk about the Senate.
All right, thanks, Erin. It's always good to be back here at Furman, and this was the University Center when I was here. We called it the UC, so this whole area looks very different than when I was here, but I remember coming to many things in Burgess as well, and I spent a lot of time in the Paladin office here, just around the corner as well. So I have good news for you. If this presidential race is a toss-up and the House is a toss-up, the Senate is not a toss-up. So I think this is one that we very well could know on election night, and it is a place where Republicans are favored to win back a majority. And that is because it matters which third of the Senate is up. And Democrats are defending 23 seats. They have 4 incumbents that caucus with Democrats to just 11 seats for Republicans. And overwhelmingly, those 23 seats are either in presidential battlegrounds like Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, or in very red states like West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio. So as Erin talked about, sort of 2022 the midterms didn't go the way that we would historically expect them to go, in that, Republicans did better, or Democrats did better than expected in the House, making that closer. But in the Senate as well, Democrats actually managed to gain seats, which was, I think, had to do with candidate quality in some races, particularly in places like Georgia, where you had Herschel Walker running, in Arizona, where you had Blake Masters that was running, and in Pennsylvania, where you had Dr. Oz running. So Republicans set out this cycle to recruit better candidates. And I think in some places they've succeeded, but they're, just if the goal is to get to 51, which it is, you ask Mitch McConnell and he will emphasize, we want 51. That gets us to a majority. I think they're on a very good path to do that. I put the odds somewhere, probably around 75%, that they will win the Senate. And that is because, again, so it's very important that Democrats managed to actually pick up a seat, and they defended every single incumbent last cycle, and they picked up a seat, the open seat in Pennsylvania, because there's no room for error in this Senate map. So 51-49, you can see here on our ratings, though, that Joe Manchin there, retiring in West Virginia, is in the solid Republican column. So that race, Democrats are not even contesting that. We know that they are going to pick up that open seat, and that the governor of West Virginia, Jim Justice, and more importantly, his English bulldog, Baby Dog, will be headed to the Senate. I think Baby Dog is going to be the star of the Senate next year. So that means that we functionally started a 50-50 Senate, which means that Democrats cannot lose any incumbents, and they also need Kamala Harris to win the presidency so that Tim Walz would be the tie-breaking vote. But the problem lies in Montana. As you can see, we have that race in our lean Republican column. And I'll just skip ahead to one slide to sort of give you an idea. Erin sort of talked about the decreasing number of seats where we see crossover votes in the House. In the Senate, it's become even more stark in recent years, and I think this graphic gives you a good idea of, looking back even in the 1980s, there were 45 senators that represented a different party of how most recently their state had voted. Today there are 5. In 2016, every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential race. In 2020, only Susan Collins of Maine managed to win re-election, even as Biden carried her state. So she outperformed Trump by 7 points and managed to win. The bad news for these other senators that are up this cycle, like Jon Tester, is that he sits in a state that Trump carried by 16 points and is likely to carry by at least that much again, possibly more. And Sherrod Brown, also in Ohio, who represents a state that Trump carried twice by 8 points. So Tester actually started off this cycle in as strong a position as he could, really. His approval ratings were upwards of 60% in some polls. But as I talked about, sort of candidate recruitment, I think really mattered here. Republicans were able to intervene in this primary, get a clear field for their favorite candidate, Tim Sheehy, who's a former Navy SEAL, Purple Heart recipient, very young candidate, in his 40s. Actually, I think he's my age, late 30s, but very young, showcasing his family. But Jon Tester sort of is Montana, the flat top haircut, dirt farmer. He's lost 3 fingers to a meat grinder. So he's really emphasized, I'm Montana, and Tim Sheehy is sort of part of the problem, sort of the Yellowstonification of Montana, that these rich out-of-staters come in, they buy up all the land, they raise up the home prices. But Tim Sheehy still has an R beside of his name. He's run ads. I think his ads have been very good in emphasizing his kids are born in Montana. He emphasized his military service. Now he's had some missteps there, stereotypical things he said about Native Americans in the state and trying to explain a gunshot wound. But overall, he's had a lot of money poured into this race. He's put some of his own money in the race as well. And he's given, I think, he's given voters a reason to vote for him. Montana is a very parochial state. And when Jon Tester was first elected in 2006, over half of the state, close to almost 60% of people were born there in Montana. We've had a lot of people move in, especially after COVID, from more conservative people leaving California, Oregon, Washington, more liberal states, moving to Montana. They've brought that sort of native rate down to where it's only anywhere between 1/3 and 40%. So Tester's argument that, I'm the one really from Montana doesn't fly as well. So Tester has been, for the past really 2 months or so, Tester has been pretty consistently behind. Now it's still close. It's within the margin of error in at least Democratic polling. So, I don't completely count him out, but at this point it would be a surprise if Tester were to win. So that's the tipping point state, basically. So that gets Republicans to 51. And then I think we're looking at how much more can they grow their margin, or can they find a state to offset that loss, which is a possibility as well. Ohio is the next likeliest state to flip. Sherrod Brown, I mentioned before, while I think that Tim Sheehy has run a good race with sort of giving candidates a reason to vote for him, Bernie Moreno in Ohio has run, I think, a subpar race, where he has not sort of run ads and introducing himself to candidates. I watched a focus group of Trump voters in that state recently, and they couldn't really tell you anything about Moreno. He's a luxury car dealer, an immigrant from Colombia, but all they could sort of repeat were the barrage of Democratic super PAC ads saying that he'd stiffed workers, that he'd shredded wage documents, and had laid off single moms. So they could repeat those. So I think that's sort of a key thing that's missing there. Now, Moreno's team is banking on the fact that if they win the Trump voters, they win. And that is correct. So they're running ads emphasizing that, we're the Trump endorsed candidate. Abortion is, I think abortion is an issue in Montana as well, that Tester is still trying to leverage. There is an abortion referendum on the ballot. But in Ohio, they recently passed an abortion referendum solidifying abortion rights there. Moreno, well, we've seen some other candidates kind of walk back their support for, or kind of say they support exceptions or that they wouldn't support a national abortion ban. Moreno hasn't really done that. In fact, recently he was caught on camera saying that, he doesn't really know why women over 50 are concerned about abortion rights. So they're really hammering that. That's popping in focus groups that I've been told, but it's still very, very close. It's within the margin of error. I've seen polls with Moreno up 1, with Brown up 1. It's going to be very, very close. And then the races that we have more recently moved into the toss-up column are where we see these presidential battlegrounds. And there's a differentiation between the races in Arizona and Nevada in the Sun Belt than these blue wall states. In fact, just yesterday, I moved the Pennsylvania Senate race into the toss-up column, moved Wisconsin 2 weeks ago. Michigan, being an open seat, has been there for a little bit, but I think all of these are very much within the margin of error. Our toss-up column sort of encapsulates a little bit more of an elasticity there when it comes, but we've seen these races while Democrats had a lead for much of the summer, that those have evaporated, and we're seeing these races come more in line with the presidential race as we've seen the tightening in those key battleground states, as Erin was talking about, just where the averages have all of those states basically tied. So Tammy Baldwin has been able to, another thing I would emphasize about some of these incumbents is that they have run in very favorable election years. John Tester, Sherrod Brown were elected in 2006, the first midterm election, well, not the first midterm election, but really the backlash midterm election that Bush suffered, because 2002 was right after 9/11. So 2006, backlash to the Iraq War. In 2012, they ran as Obama was winning re-election, and in 2018, they were re-elected when the backlash to President Trump in his first midterm election. So they're facing much bigger headwinds than they did in the past. Tammy Baldwin was elected in 2012. She's had weak opponents in the past, and her Republican opponent, Erin Covey, I think got off to a really rough start, but he's put in $20 million of his own money, which is more than her 2012 opponent, former Governor Tommy Thompson, and her 2018 opponent, Leah Vukmir, spent combined. So he's been able to blanket the airwaves. I think he's taken himself out of some of his ads. He didn't come across that really great in them. He's, I think, struggled to answer some answers about the Farm Bill. Baldwin has run stronger in a lot of Wisconsin's rural areas, and if she doesn't have to win those, but if she can sort of more closely even the margins, and then really run up the areas in Milwaukee, especially some of the suburban counties out of there that we've seen move, and then in Madison and Dane County, I think she has a good shot there, but this is the state that I've seen tighten most closely with the presidential result. And I would actually probably at this point rank it the third most vulnerable seat for Democrats. Pennsylvania might be the next. If David McCormick had been the nominee in 2022, I think there's a good chance he's a U.S. Senator right now. He was not. He lost that race to Dr. Oz. And we talked about sort of, Hovey's also been hit for his ties to California, owning a home in Orange County and different things. David McCormick grew up in Pennsylvania, which was more ties than Dr. Oz had, having just gone to medical school there. But he still had a home in Connecticut. He's put a lot of his own money in the race, and he's had super PACs that have poured millions of dollars in there as well. He's a former hedge fund executive. He was in the George W. Bush administration. He's more of a sort of your traditional Republican. He's not necessarily a MAGA Republican in that regard. But he also, in trying to win that primary in 2022, he said he did not support exceptions for rape and incest on abortion. He's walked that back, but they have clips of him still saying that. So again, where we've seen Democrats really make gains in Pennsylvania are in those suburban counties around Philadelphia, but where we see, Republicans have an increased registration advantage that's happening in Pennsylvania right now, and where I've seen particular movement in both Democratic and Republican polls are in the western part of the state, particularly in and around Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. So that's where McCormick is catching up to Trump's numbers, and where we've seen Casey's numbers a little bit stagnate. Now, he comes from a well-known political family. He's been running ahead of Harris by a couple of points, but I think they're about even now, maybe a point or 2 point difference or so. His father was governor. He's really hitting, like I said, McCormick on abortion, which is interesting because he used to be sort of the last pro-life Democrat in the Senate. And I think that race is very close. Erin talked about Michigan a little bit there. Democrats definitely got a very strong recruit with Alyssa Slotkin. in that contest, when Debbie Stabenow decided to retire, was part of this cohort of Democrats elected in 2018, national security Democrats. She was a former CIA operative. She talks in her first ad about how she was in New York City on 9/11. She has photos of her working in the Bush White House and in the Obama White House. So she's really made that a big emphasis. Her opponent is former Congressman Mike Rogers, which feels like he was in politics, well, it was a decade ago, but even longer because he left office in 2014, which was before Trump took over the party. He really is sort of typifies that type of Bush sort of establishment type Republican. And I think that's sort of, he struggled to raise money in that race a little bit. He'd moved to Florida, moved back. He has not had a lot. He's been sort of the worst fundraiser of this, but we've seen outside groups pour a lot of money into this race. I think one reason Democrats are still doing so well, despite the challenging map, is that their candidates have had far much more money to spend, that they have been better at fundraising. Again, Republicans had hoped to sort of cut into some of that fundraising advantage by recruiting wealthy candidates that could self-fund. Some of those have sort of lived up to that, like Hovde and McCormick, but others that said that they were going to fund their campaign, like Bernie Moreno in Ohio, have not, and so that's made a big difference. When we're looking at all of the ad spending, candidates get lower rates, so their dollars can go further than super PAC ads, which in some of these really saturated states like Pennsylvania or Michigan, those ads are sometimes 30, 35 times the rate right now that we're seeing. So I think those are the races that I expect to determine whether maybe Republicans have a 1-seat majority, maybe a 4-seat majority when it comes down to it. And the races that haven't materialized, where, again, candidate quality we've seen that has mattered, is in Arizona and in Nevada. Nevada really should have been more competitive because you have a first-term senator in Jackie Rosen, and I talked about how sort of parochial Montana is. Nevada's sort of the opposite because you have about half of the state turns over every 4 to 6 years. It's a very transient state, so voters don't really know who their members are. Now Democrats have a very good get-out-the-vote operation, especially with the unions and the culinary unions. Sort of the ghost of Harry Reid is still very much alive and well in that state. And Jackie Rosen has been able to sort of build off of that, even though she's a first-term senator. She had a very rapid rise in politics. She was a synagogue president, was elected to the House in 2016, and then was elected to the Senate 2 years later. Her opponent is Sam Brown, another Purple Heart recipient, was badly burned after stepping on an IED. He just hasn't been able to raise money or get his name out. And also she has pilloried him on the issue of abortion. He even tried to neutralize it early on, featuring an interview with his wife, Amy, who talked about how she'd had an abortion before they were married, but he just hasn't had the money to communicate. And so that's a race that we still see, again, it's pretty significant 6 to 7 point gap in. If I talk about where candidate quality matters, it matters in Arizona. Because if they wanted to not get really controversial candidates, they failed in Arizona. Carrie Lake was the 2022 gubernatorial nominee. She lost that race narrowly. She will not tell you that she lost it. She still maintains to this day that she won and has challenged it in court. She came into that race with incredibly high negatives. The Republicans, it was sort of a marriage of convenience that they saw that she was going to run. They didn't see any way that she wasn't going to win the primary, so they tried to get behind her. And, it's just, she's had a lot of gaffes. She hasn't had money. And her Democratic opponent, Ruben Gallego, who when he first started running, I actually thought he was too liberal for Arizona especially. He's more liberal, more progressive, was a member of the Progressive Caucus in the House, more liberal than Mark Kelly, that won this race twice. And he actually got into primary Kyrsten Sinema, who then left and became an independent. But he's had a lot of money to sort of tell his story as a Marine Corps veteran being raised in poverty by a single mom, and that's helped him open up an edge there. And so this is one of the rare places where we do see these crossover voters, and I think it's just because Lake is so underperforming Trump there, and I think what polling I've seen is that Gallego is making particular gains while Trump has made gains, as Erin said, with Black men and Latino men. Gallego is winning a lot of those still. I'll touch just quickly on Maryland, as I talked about just how difficult it is to win those crossover voters in a state with 16 points. Republicans, this is a race we wouldn't even be talking about had Larry Hogan not run. Very popular former governor. voters fundamentally look at a vote for governor and a vote for Senate very differently. When you're voting for Senate, as I showed on that other slide, you're voting for who you want to control the Senate. So, but for governor, people still vote more for party, for person rather than the party. It's how Kentucky has a Democratic governor, how Vermont has a Republican governor. So Hogan was able to win twice in Maryland. They got him to run for this seat, but it's a seat that Biden carried by 33 points. And he's running against a woman, Angela Also Brooks, who's the Prince George County executive. She won her primary despite being vastly outspent by David Trone, who, yes, funded the building that we are standing in right now, Furman alum. So she's sort of already outperformed the odds. I think she is on pace to be the only the third black woman elected to the Senate, both her and then also in a race that is not competitive but has an open seat in Delaware. Lisa Blunt Rochester will also be elected as a black woman to the Senate. So I think we are on pace to have, for the first time in history, 2 black women in the Senate at the same time. And so if we're seeing that Democrats are going to lose a seat in Montana, they have to find another seat. And there's 2 places where I would watch for potential upsets. Texas is the main one. And Democrats really got a recruiting coup when they got Colin Allred to run. Another Democrat that flipped a seat from red to blue in the Dallas suburbs in 2018. He's a former Baylor football captain, worked in the Obama Justice Department, played for the Tennessee Titans. And he represented a swing seat, but then his seat was actually redistricted to be a safe seat. So he could have had that seat for as long as he wanted, probably risen up the ranks in House leadership. But they convinced him to run for Senate. You know, he's running against Ted Cruz, who is an incredibly polarizing figure. You know, Beto O'Rourke challenged him in 2018, came within about 2.5 points. And Allred's really using a different strategy than Beto. While Beto had a very grassroots strategy, was sort of everywhere. He went to all 254 counties. Allred has just sort of used an air assault. He's vastly outspent Cruz on the air. He's been able to sort of run positive ads, particularly hammering on abortion. And I say the 2 things that makes this race different from Cruz is abortion. Texas is one of the most stringent abortion laws in the country, and Cancun. So in 2021, when Texas had a massive winter storm, power grid failure, Cruz was on vacation with his family in Cancun. He got completely pilloried for it, had to come back. There was sort of this infamous image of him rolling his suitcase with a Texas mask on through the airport. Allred, he hasn't even had to say that in his ads. He can just show that ad, and it invokes that. I watched a focus group of Trump voters who were undecided in the Senate race. Get very animated here. Every single one of them brought up Cancun, unprompted. So Cruz is very disliked. I still think in a state like Texas, though, where Trump is still going to win the state by probably 6 to 7 points, is still very hard. But this is probably the most competitive pickup opportunity that Democrats have. And then there's an interesting scenario happening in Nebraska. I did not think 2 weeks out from the election that I would be talking about Nebraska at all, unless it was about the 2nd congressional district, which is up for grabs, but leaning toward Democrats in the Electoral College. There's actually 2 Senate races happening in Nebraska. One is the appointed senator, the former governor, Pete Ricketts. He's going to win easily. It's Deb Fischer, who is a 2-term Republican. She went back on a term limits pledge. And she's running against an independent, Dan Osborne. Now so there's no Democrat in the race. He's getting a lot of Democratic support, but he said he won't caucus with either party, which I think it's hard to do functionally. You have to kind of pick a side if you want committee appointments. He's getting a lot of help from a super PAC that is funded by Democratic donors. Republicans have now sort of had to go in and rescue him with a lot of ads, just again emphasizing that he's basically a Democrat in sheep's clothing, but he has such a blue-collar appeal. You know, he said, you know, the $174,000 salary of a senator would be an increase from his current job. You know, that he's a mechanic. He says, send a mechanic to Washington. His latest ad, he's taking a blowtorch to a television with all of the ads that he says are lies about him. So I think he does have this unique crossover appeal that has made this race more competitive than it should be. I recently moved into lean Republican, but I think getting over that hump in the same way with Texas is just very hard. So where we functionally are, we could see, you know, a state like Arizona that, again, votes for Trump perhaps, probably his best state at this point in the Electoral College of the toss-up states. votes for Trump, but probably elects Ruben Gallego. Maybe that happens in Nevada as well. But the states that are in the toss-up column, in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, if I had to bet that the way the presidential race goes in those states, I think the Senate race probably goes as well. So.
I'll have Jessica sit up here and invite Erin and Rui and Danielle to come up, and I'll introduce the two new panelists here right now. So Rui Teixeira on the far end is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the transformation of party coalitions and the future of American electoral politics. Rui started his education at Yale University, but left to pursue political interests. He eventually earned his BA from the University of Michigan and his MS and PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we overlapped and certainly passed each other on Bascom Hill at some point. Just didn't know when. Anyway, Teixeira is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles. He is a co-author of The Emerging Democratic Majority, one of the most influential books, which was selected as one of the best books of the year by The Economist. And his most recent book, which I happen to have right here, is Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. And finally, he co-edits one of my favorite Substacks, The Liberal Patriot, which I read faithfully. So anyway, that's Rui, and Danielle is familiar to most of you. Danielle Vincent is professor of politics and international affairs at Furman University. She earned a BA at Furman and an MA and PhD at Duke University. She is the author of numerous articles and books exploring the role of the media in Congress. Her most recent book is Congress and the Media, Beyond Institutional Power, published by Oxford University Press. Please welcome our additional panelists. So I'd like to start out the panel discussion with the new panelists giving us an idea of, I did something wrong here. I guess, oh yeah, you did. Okay, that's fine. Oh, that's good. Good. Okay, we'll do that. I'd like to ask them to comment on what they have heard and maybe add to it if they have some ideas. But I would actually like to throw a wrench into that just a little bit and ask the two of you, so what does this matter? I mean, who cares if one of the parties wins the House or the Senate? What's at stake here? Danielle?
Everything.
And yeah, use the mic, please, and speak in.
I didn't want to yell. Is the microphone on?
Yeah, but you have to really talk into it.
Okay,
There
can
you
you
go.
hear me? Excellent. I feel like I'm broadcasting so sportive right about now. Okay. Yes, it matters greatly. I don't know if you have noticed, Congress doesn't always get a lot done, especially if they don't have unified control of Congress and the White House. It's right now we've got a situation where Democrats barely control the Senate and Republicans barely control the House. It's sort of functional when you absolutely need it to be, like, okay, the government's still functioning right now with a budget, sort of. We'll find out in December if they can keep that going. When the debt limit needs to be raised, it helps if Congress and the president are controlled by the same, or at least if Congress is controlled by the same party. It gets really hard when you have divided control with Congress in the hands of one party and president in control of the other party, or even right now in situations where you have divided control. If Kamala Harris, for example, were to face a Republican Senate, just getting a cabinet named, potentially replacing a Supreme Court justice, all of that matters. And so, yes, the functioning of Congress is at stake as we figure out which party is actually going to control Congress.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost certainly the case that we will have divided government, I think, in this next iteration, though if there is a trifecta, it'll almost certainly be Republican rather than Democrat, I think, realistically at this point. They're sure to take the Senate. If they take, not sure, but probable, if they win the presidency, then I think the sense that I get from you folks is that they'll probably squeak through keeping the House. So, I mean, there are a lot of things to go wrong with that. But if there is a trifecta, it's probably one of the Republicans. But anyway, I think that there's a really good chance we're just going to wind up with divided government. Again, why is divided government a problem? Because basically it makes it really hard to get stuff done. And to me, it underlines what is an incredibly salient fact about today's political era. There really is no dominant majority coalition. I put out a big report from the American Enterprise Institute with my colleague Yuval Levin called Politics Without Winners. Can either party build a majority coalition? And I think, win or lose, we're likely to see this election just continue that trend that's gone on for a generation where neither party can really dominate American politics in any consistent way and therefore really set the tone for the country and to which the other party then has to react. We have this kind of toggling back and forth between which party seems dominant at whatever time, and which to some extent is driven by negative partisanship, like which party has hated the most at any given time. So, this is not particularly healthy for the country politically, socially, economically, and probably any other way. Unfortunately, it looks like that's probably what we'll get. In our paper, actually, Yuval and I, we kind of argue that, well, why is this? It's not for lack of opportunity. I mean, there is a path for either party to occupy the center of American politics, but they're not really trying very hard to do it. And because they're not trying very hard to do it, well, what do you wind up with? You wind up with a 50-50 nation. You wind up with a presidential election that's a hair's breadth that separates the candidates, and where we can't predict how the House is going to go. The Senate, it's probably going to be a narrow margin, whoever takes it. It's just kind of a big mess. So I don't want to make anyone depressed here, but I think that is the reality of today's electoral politics and electoral coalitions. And I think what one or two speakers here have so ably explained is just how much of a knife edge everything is. I mean, I think they laid it out very well, and I frankly have found little to disagree with in terms of their assessments.
I would, if I can just add one thing, because I think this is why when it comes to the Senate,
Get right into that, Mike.
I think that's why when it comes to the Senate,
It might have decided to go off. Push
Yes.
really hard. No, the other one. You should turn it. Okay. Pass it down.
okay.
I just talked about
Yeah. All right, I think that's why when we talk about where the Senate majority, how big a Republicans have a majority could potentially stymie a Harris presidency if that's what we end up with. Because I'm hearing Republicans say, again, they're increasingly confident that they'll win just because the math is on their side. But if you end up with 51, 52 seats, in the same way that Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema sort of moderated some of the things that Joe Biden wanted to do, the power in that instance would lie with Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine. So, if Harris is trying to get through cabinet, she could potentially pick off some of their voters, but if they have 53, 54 seats, you don't necessarily need those in that regard. So that's why I'm kind of looking at where that lies.
Erin, do you have something? React.
I agree with all of this. And at the beginning of the cycle, I think the question on a lot of folks' minds was, would voters punish Republicans for how the past 2 years went in the House and a historically unproductive Congress? But I think ultimately voters care about what happens in their lives. They care about their pocketbooks. They care about having access to health care. And those are ultimately going to be more dominating factors in terms of how voters will vote. But the dysfunction obviously impacts Congress, how it functions, and it impacts the ability of whatever party is in control to actually run strong campaigns. So structurally, there are some damaging effects to dysfunction on how the campaigns go, but largely it doesn't affect how elections go, and I think that's part of the problem here. And I think we're probably on the path to that, for that to continue for the next couple of cycles, unless one of the parties does take a larger majority of the country.
Erin, I was going to ask you, you said that you thought there was a slight advantage for the Republicans in terms of taking the House. I was just looking at the split ticket side, and they have D, 53% probability taking the House. Do you have a sense of why your analysis would differ from them, or are you just basically reading off of the presidential office?
That's a good question.
They've now shifted to 53-47, like Nate Silver and a few other sides for Trump.
That's a fair question, and I mean, I think you'll see there's discrepancies with both the presidential models and the House models in terms of whether it slightly leans towards Republicans or leans towards Democrats, and that varies day to day based on the public polls that come out. With the House, it's tough because there's so little public polling, and so oftentimes the assessments we're making, we're looking at candidates fundraising, we're looking at historic numbers, which of course is getting put into the split ticket models and these other algorithmic models as well. But I'm also looking at a lot of internal data that unfortunately never sees the light of day. And I'm looking at data from both parties over time. So, you know, you can argue that, okay, sometimes maybe if it's a partisan pollster, they might favor their own party a little bit, but that gets offset by the data from the other party that I'm seeing. And so, you know, it does seem like if you're looking at just the number of current split districts that Republicans would have more defense to play because they have those 16 Biden-held districts right now. But I think from what I'm seeing in the polls, they may not be running in 16 Harris districts. That might be the issue for Democrats. It might be that Democrats have losses in places like the Central Valley in California or on Long Island in New York. So I think, I certainly think it's absolutely possible for Democrats to take back the House. And when I say Republicans have a really slight edge, it is like the tiniest of edges. But I would have trouble quantifying, like maybe a 52% or something like that. But I think and that can shift, you know, from week to week. I will say the momentum is more on Democrats' side because they have a huge fundraising advantage over Republicans in the House, in most of these House races. So,
I mean, really in the presidential race and the Senate races, they have fundraising advantages
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, that's all
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah.
Aaron, let me stick with you for just a second. I want to know, what would let's say the Democrats win the House by the same 4 seats that the Republicans have now, and Jeffries becomes the Speaker. What does, and I don't know who's taking the White House, but what does the Democratic majority in that case want to do with its new power? I'm not sure, what legislation will they propose? What will they try to do? How will they look different than the Republicans?
right, I mean, it's really tough because in this scenario, Republicans still have control of the Senate, right? But I do think that Democrats' strongest priorities probably would be trying to protect abortion access at some level, on the federal level. I think they've made that clear, and that, that is the issue, that when you poll voters nationwide, that they trust Democrats more on the Republicans. Whereas on the flip side, right now, voters trust Republicans more on immigration and on economic issues. And so I think that would probably be their main priority. I don't know past that, a lot of the Democratic Party's goals right now are kind of in opposition to the Republican Party and opposition to Trump. So it's not entirely clear to me what the agenda would be, and also how they would temper that with the realistic, the realistic nature of the fact that probably they won't be able to get a lot of this done if Republicans have the Senate.
Danielle?
That's actually one scenario that might give me a slim sliver of hope on maybe 1 or 2 issues. If you had a Democratic House, even with a Republican Senate, assuming Murkowski and Collins still matter in swinging a vote one way or the other, in that scenario, regardless of whether you get Harris or Trump, I think you could get some form of immigration reform. Because the House Democrats are a bit more pragmatic. Yes, they're ideological, but they are a bit more pragmatic than their ideological counterparts on the House Republican side, particularly think Freedom Caucus. Hakeem Jeffries isn't worried about losing his position as leader of the Democrats on the basis of any negotiated settlement with a Republican Senate if it starts to move at least some of this, solve some of that problem. Whereas Mike Johnson has to worry on a daily basis from any corner of his caucus that he could be in trouble as the leader of the Republicans. So I actually think in that scenario, regardless of who became president, as long as there is a small enough margin in the Senate that your sort of reasonable people on both sides would matter, I think you could get something done on immigration.
Isn't it true that it's been kind of a bipartisan, what few things that have gotten through have been sort of bipartisan, right? It's been a bipartisan Congress. I'm looking at Erin, but but Jessica.
That's what you need to get it through.
I know, well, yeah, but they've done some things.
They have, and there has been, I think Biden has been able to definitely navigate some of these issues, like federal gun laws and infrastructure legislation and some environmental legislation as well. But I don't know. It's some of that depends on Republicans. Majority in the Senate. Obviously, they need 60 votes to get much done in the Senate because of the filibuster, but which they won't have. But and I think it would still be quite difficult for even something like immigration reform, where we saw maybe some progress start to be made on that issue. If Republicans have control of the Senate, you still have all of these senators whose re-election prospects depend to a certain extent on winning the primaries, where they have to keep their base happy. And keeping their base happy oftentimes means keeping Trump happy. And so I don't know how much, of course, this depends on whether Trump is president or not.
Exactly.
But if Trump is president and the Democrats have the House, the Republicans have the Senate, I would have a hard time seeing a real immigration reform pass through that scenario because of that.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to y'all. And I'm going to start with Louis down there. You're saying that if there is going to be a trifecta, it will be Republican. What would we expect out of a Republican White House, Senate, and House? Assuming that they're still close, but there is a majority. And we'll just go right on down. I can't wait to hear what y'all have to say.
Well, I think it's actually pretty hard to say exactly what they try to pursue. I mean, if you look at what Trump is running on, I mean, it's kind of all over the place, right? I mean, there's all kinds of sort of flamboyant promises that are made, but how easy would it be to turn these into legislation? What could they do in immigration? What could they do in manufacturing industrial policy? What could they do in a lot of things where Trump's promises are rather outsized, but then when you actually had to deal with actually getting legislation passed, I mean, there's no way they're going to have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. That's not going to happen. Maybe they have 53, 54 seats. So what do you do in terms of actually making things happen? And what would be their number one priority? I mean, that's not clear to me, actually, when I look at the way Trump is running, what his number one priority would be if he was a president, if he had the House and the Senate. So what do you guys think? What would the Donald try to do?
In the microphone, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's talked a lot about tariffs, I think, and actually I think Harris should be talking more about this and the effect that it would have on the economy and some of the things. She talked about it a little bit at the opening of the first debate, and I was even having Republicans tell me that's something she should really emphasize. We haven't really seen that as much since. I think we could see a lot of difference on foreign policy, especially on Ukraine aid, and what that could happen in the Senate. And again, I think that depends on how big of a majority they have. And also, remember, we can get a different, see if Mike Johnson survives, if Republicans win the majority, if you have Hakeem Jeffries, but we will have a new Republican leader with Mitch McConnell not running again. And so is that probably the front runners right now are John Thune of South Dakota, John Cornyn of Texas, Rick Scott is also throwing his hat in the ring there from Florida, which I think is just sort of a
thumbing his nose at Mitch McConnell, who he hates, but who do they get behind in that regard? What types of Republicans are elected? Are they ones that are probably more in line to get behind a Thune or a Cornyn? I think you would see largely sort of a continuation of the way that McConnell has run the Senate. But if you have sort of, I call them sort of the rabble-rouser caucus of, Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Rand Paul and Rick Scott in there, if they're able to sort of get someone in there, you could see a very different approach to foreign aid in particular, I think.
So you'd think they'd try to pass tariffs, but when Ukraine, this would be omission, not commission, right? Because they basically try to end American aid to.
Yeah, I think we would see, we've already seen, J.D. Vance push for that, obviously, and different things. Yeah, when I talk with European groups, that's one of the biggest things they're concerned about in a Trump presidency is what would happen to Ukraine aid in particular.
Erin?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think what's difficult to judge, though, is the elected officials within the Republican Party are still very much divided on these issues of foreign policy and on trade. And they're not in line, while the base of the party has certainly shifted on these issues and has become a lot more isolationist in the Trump era, and as the party's coalition has shifted, that has continued to be the case. At the same time, particularly in the Senate, but also to a certain extent in the House, there's still a lot of old guard Republicans who I think would be very resistant to cutting off Ukraine aid and to increasing tariffs dramatically at the level at which Trump says he wants to increase them. So I'm not sure, I don't know. I think probably there would be some rollback of a lot of the environmental regulations that Biden introduced, because I think that was one area where this doesn't get a lot of, it doesn't get a lot of attention in the media because a lot of it hasn't been felt yet by voters, but there was significant progress made on that. And I think that's one area where kind of all of the wings of the Republican Party are a little more in alignment than compared to issues like maybe foreign policy or trade, but hard to say.
Yeah.
Just to add a couple of things. One, I don't know that the filibuster is actually the obstacle that it is now, because I don't think they think twice about getting rid of it. Trump, unlike Biden, who was always a little, don't really mess with the filibuster, I think Trump would happily throw out the filibuster if it gets him what he wants. And I think there are fewer institutionalists without Mitch McConnell in charge of the Republicans to try to hang on to it. So I think that.
Danielle, explain the filibuster for those who haven't taken it
For those
101.
who have not taken American government. The filibuster is in anything, well, in almost every piece of legislation. To cut off debate, you would need 60 votes.
In the Senate.
In the Senate, not in the House. House just, if you can get a majority degree, you can do anything you want to in the House. They do daily. It just goes nowhere in the Senate because of the filibuster, right? You go to talk, you stand up, you control the floor, you tag team with other people who think like you, usually in your party. You can control the floor for months on end if you really want to, until you get 60 people to cut you off. They've already wound that back on appointments, Supreme Court appointments, judicial appointments, executive branch appointments. They ditched the filibuster because they can do it basically by agreement of the majority party. Joe Biden wasn't particularly excited about encouraging them to get rid of the filibuster, even though a lot of Democrats wanted to, especially in the first 2 years of Biden's presidency. Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, and Kirsten Sinema, the Democrat turned independent from Arizona, both were the sort of holdups there. They would not back off of it. So I don't think you've got that kind of protection as much now, especially if they get more than a few people over the required majority for Republicans in the Senate. So I think the filibuster could potentially be thrown out, at least selectively on certain pieces of legislation. I think the other thing we're overlooking here is the budget process. You can easily get around certain parts of the filibuster through a budget reconciliation process. I will not go into detail here. Take the Congress class next year, it'll be fun. Spend a lot of time on budget reconciliation. That gets you around the filibuster and allows you to vote on things with a simple majority. It can't be used all the time for everything, But I think the budget process in general, if they've got control of all three, two houses of Congress and the White House, you could do some serious budget cutting and affect policies basically by not funding things. Reducing the number of people that are enforcing the laws, reducing the number of people in certain agencies to make it next to impossible for those agencies to actually do their jobs. Trump did a little bit of trying to do that with EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and other agencies and departments during his term in office 4 years ago. So I would see that coming back with a vengeance this time around. I also think he'll try to do a lot through executive actions and just, only refer to Congress when he absolutely has to. And I don't see a Republican majority trying to stop him from doing that, right? There's not going to be a lot of oversight of the executive branch if you have unified government. So I think those kinds of things would allow them potentially to get some things done, even if you kept the filibuster.
Maybe we'll finally get infrastructure.
I can't,
That's done.
I can't wait for tax cuts on all the overtime I work.
And the tax cuts
You
will
know?
be renewed. I guarantee you that will keep.
And
No tax on.
since Mexico isn't funding the wall, we're gonna have to do it. I know. All right. I'm opening up to questions. I like students first. You're paying the money for this. Please have a question. We don't, we can do speeches, but let's have a question in there. And I am looking around for a hand of someone. Am I missing something? Yes, Noah. Please stand up so we can hear you. Is there a microphone back there, Sim? No? No. Okay, we don't have a mic, so just be really loud.
So this could be directed at anyone really, but if so you all said that Murkowski and Collins could matter, for instance, if the Senate were a 51-seat majority for the GOP when the dust settles. But if the Senate majority leader can block things, like not even put things up to the table, or if things can not even be considered for discussion, for instance, if McConnell could not even consider the appointment of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court before the 2016 election, does Murkowski and Collins really matter, especially if a new Republican leader will take the place and might likely be a bit of a continuation with what McConnell sort of did?
Yeah, I think Jessica's one for that.
Yeah, I mean, if we had another scenario like that, I think that's a different thing with the Supreme Court appointment. If we're talking sort of about a Harris administration's cabinet appointments and different things, I think if they were sort of more mainstream. And she said she would appoint a Republican, maybe multiple Republicans if she needs to get them through the Senate. Someone like Jeff Flake or Liz Cheney, who's endorsed her, Adam Kinzinger, all of these people I think would probably be in the mix or different things. I mean, I still see a John Thune and a John Cornyn as more institutionalist, maybe not to the same extent that a Mitch McConnell is, but again, if it were Supreme Court, like I think they could approach that differently, but I do think that you would, I'm not, you might see some things different, but I'm not sure that they would really overhaul the Senate that much in a very different way than Mitch McConnell has. Again, if a Rick Scott somehow becomes the Senate majority leader, which given his tenure at the National Republican Senatorial Committee last year, I have a lot of questions about that would happen, or if there's sort of a dark horse candidate. I mean, even Steve Daines has been thrown in the mix there, who chairs the National Republican Senatorial Committee. He might be, I think he's still a little more of an institutionalist, not in the same thing as Rick Scott, but he is more MAGA. Perhaps because if Republicans do get a big Senate majority, they might think Daines for that, who chaired the campaign committee in that regard. So I still wouldn't be so shocked if we sort of see a dark horse candidate emerge in that. But, again, you're not going to, I think, see the same difference with Thune or Cornyn in that regard. And Barrasso would be the Senate whip in that regards too. I think he is someone who's more friendly with Trump in that regard. but yeah, I mean, and also I think there's a big question of, you know, does Susan Collins run for reelection? That she's up in 2026. You know, Tom Tillis, just nearby here, is another person to watch. He's up in 2026. I mean, he nearly got a primary challenge last time. He's shown a lot of frustration with the Trump administration. I'm not convinced he's gonna run again. He could be another person that they could sort of pick off as well, especially if he's not running for reelection.
There was a question back here. Please stand.
Yes, talk to us about national defense. Is there a possibility for a consensus, a bipartisan consensus on increasing funding for national defense? If so, what will it look like? And if not, what issue would it break on?
Well, one thing that J.D. Vance is really, I mean, if it was a Trump administration, J.D. Vance is really committed to the idea of building up the defense industrial base in the United States. It's one of his signature issues. And defense is always potentially a bipartisan issue. I mean, the CHIPS and Science Act, sort of really had this sort of national security tinge to it. The idea is we needed to build up the semiconductor industry, partly for national security competitiveness purposes. So maybe that is an area where even under a Trump administration, you can see some push in that direction to seriously promote the defense industrial base in the United States. And there's all this talk around the Ukraine war about how it's actually like pretty difficult for the U.S. to fulfill, you know, the commitments in terms of armaments and so on that have been demanded by our support for the Ukraine, and just this general sense of weakness in terms of our defense industrial base. There's been a lot of, you know, the Biden administration has been much more concerned with the transition to clean energy than it has been with our defense industrial base. I sense someone like J.D. Vance would want to reverse that.
And Trump had the Space Force, I think you see a bit more emphasis on that as well, that we haven't seen as much emphasis on. I mean, I think under Republicans, you see more of a buildup of an emphasis on defense industry certainly than you would see from Democrats, and I think especially if we're talking about what's happening in the Middle East as well, I think you would see more of a, you know, stringent backing of Israel in that regard as well.
Ma'am, back there.
Up until that last question, we hadn't discussed much about vice presidents and maybe the effect of who was chosen on the House and the Senate and how we've seen it lean. I know for vice presidents, there's a saying of like, just don't do any harm with it. And so I was wondering if you saw an effect after the vice presidents were chosen, or even after the vice presidential debate in any way for the House or the Senate in ways that it was leaning as you've been tracking it.
I don't think it's had an effect on the House and Senate, but I mean, boy, that vice presidential debate was boring, and it was welcome kind of what we used to have. Not sort of like on the edge of your seat, is someone going to fall over, are they going to lunge at each other? It was like a weird return to normalcy that was also boring and what we are used to. You know, I do think, I'm questioning, like you said, I think it is kind of that do no harm principle. Like I think Sarah Palin hurt John McCain in 2008. If Trump had known that he was going to be facing Harris instead of Biden, might he have chosen someone different? Maybe, but I also think Trump just sort of wanted to kind of have the next face of MAGA there, and feel like I remember Erin and I were both at the RNC that week and everything, and it did kind of feel like J.D. Vance was sort of a spiking the football in that regard of picking him. In that regard, I mean, I still, again, if we look at Pennsylvania, and Harris loses it by just a little bit, like, you know, I was hearing a lot of concern among Republicans about Josh Shapiro and that effect there, like, could there be some recriminations in that regard? I don't know that Walz has hurt her in that regard. I don't think he had a particularly strong debate in that regard, but I don't know that he's hurt her. I think he comes across as just kind of an affable every guy in that regard, kind of awkward. I'm surprised he didn't have a better answer in that debate about China and Tiananmen Square and different things. He really should have been more prepared for that. But I'm not seeing it have an effect on the House or Senate necessarily. I may have let Erin speak to the House, but yeah.
I mean, I just don't think that he was actually a football coach, Tim Walz, because all of my high school football coaches in the Midwest were a whole lot meaner than him. I mean, he's so nice. It just doesn't fit,
The worst
right?
thing about Walz is who he isn't, right? He isn't Josh Shapiro. He obviously would have been the correct choice for the ticket. I mean, the Vance was not a great pick for
Yeah.
Trump and really was predicated against running on Biden. And, I think Vance is righting the ship. I think he did an excellent debate. He's really potentially helped himself for 28. But, in raw electoral terms, he probably wasn't an optimizing pick. But I think that the Walz pick is worse because you had an obvious pick who would actually do her some electoral good potentially in probably the most important state in this election, and she did not pick him. And in fact, Josh Shapiro, in addition, would have more signaled, I'm really a moderate, I'm not afraid to have someone out there on my ticket who's got, sort of a reputation for doing and saying things a little bit differently, and kind of has a harder edge to them. Tim Walz was a pick that made her feel comfortable. But I think
Someone who wasn't gonna overshadow her.
wasn't going to overshadow it. I just think it was a mistake. If she loses this election, it'll be recriminations.
Okay, let me take moderator's privilege here to ask a question on that vice presidential question, follows it. In the debate, it seemed to me that those two gentlemen agreed on more things that were actually fundamentally revolutionary in American policymaking. If you think about what they agreed on, tariffs. Suddenly, we have two parties that are protectionists. Child tax credits, and any program that had something to do with the social welfare state was approved by both parties, representatives of both parties. Housing, tax credits, aid to children. I mean, good grief. Do we now have a socially progressive majority in America and we just haven't awakened to it?
What do you mean by socially progressive?
Well, okay, now you gotta get into details, but
Like abortion? What do you mean?
no, I don't mean on social policy, those social issues like abortion or gun control. I mean on the nitty-gritty of things like support for families and support for working people and support for industries in America.
Neoliberal economic policy and how we
Reject all of that.
sold everybody out. Yeah, we
Right.
all know that.
We don't like that in big state, lots of spending, tax cuts, maybe for everybody.
There's some convergence there, absolutely.
I mean, I thought I was listening to a debate in Europe.
How do you get that paid for, and how do you get that through Congress?
Well, nobody asked that question.
Come on.
This is a campaign, we don't do that. But Vance never said, hey, wait a minute, we've got a big deficit, we can't do any of this.
Right.
And by the way, well, he did say we need to build up our defense. But Danielle, what do you think?
I would say he won't tell you we've got a big deficit unless you have a Democratic president with Democratic majorities in Congress trying to do it, and then he's absolutely going to oppose it, at least in the version you propose. And I think that's where we are right now. There is actually a lot of potential common ground about the problems that need to be solved, and even some of the potential solutions to those problems. But not if it's going to take that issue and give the other side a win that they can use in the next election, or if it's going to keep me from beating them over the head with that issue because they haven't solved it. Witness immigration this past year.
Yeah, that was very
You
well said.
had a bipartisan agreement in the Senate that was actually shockingly conservative for a Democratic president to say, I will support this. You had enough people in Congress that would have voted for it to make it a law if the Speaker of the House had been willing to give up his own job and put it on the floor.
Yeah.
But he was going to lose his position, and he was going to have to hear about it from a good chunk of his caucus. And that's going to be true whatever the issue is in many cases. Unless it mutually benefits both parties to get rid of it, they're going to fight about it.
That's well said. David?
Erin had maybe 20% or 15% of the House races up there. Presumably that means vast majority are safe seats, and there's no point talking about them. How do we get away from, and I've not heard one of Ray's colleagues on the way in here, his colleagues on the way in here talk with you all about ranked choice choice voting and things that would create more competitive primaries and keep people from being primary. How do you all are the experts on elections, how do we get back to the place where we've got truly competitive seats in Congress?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and there's certainly better people who are equipped to go into the solutions to that. But I do think that under our current electoral system, it is going to be really difficult to move away from that. And you know, that's why we've seen movements in states like Alaska and in Maine, and even this year in Arizona and Nevada, to move to different ways of electing Congress, whether that's ranked choice voting, which is where you would see potentially a candidate have to win over a broader base of support in order to win an election rather than by just winning a plurality. And then there's also open primaries. That's another tactic that states like California and Washington have tried to make all candidates run on the same ballot. There's a lot of disagreements, I know, about which ones of these reforms are more effective than others. There's, you know, multi-member districts. That could be another way to potentially increase the competitiveness and the incentive structure for members of the House. But I think where we are at right now, I don't see the trend in terms of the number of the competitive districts in the House turning around anytime soon unless there is a change in the way we elect members of Congress. And you know, a lot of it does come down to primaries and the fact that because most of these districts are safe seats, most members of Congress are only worried about their primary fights. They're not worried about their general elections. And we've seen on both sides of the aisle how a member going out of line can really just destroy their political career. You know, we've seen that on issues like Trump's impeachment. And there were Republican members of Congress who lost re-election in 2022 because they voted to impeach Trump. On the flip side, there are Democratic members in the House who lost their primaries this year in part because of their positions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so you have, you know, even within both parties, there is a lot of control of primary voters, which is of course a really small segment actually of a congressional district, over the course of these politicians' careers.
Well, let's end it there. I don't know if that's a up note or a down note, but it's kind of down. As we wrap up this evening, let me invite you to two coming events. First, if you are a member of the Furman community, you are welcome to join us in the politics department tomorrow at 12:30 for Tacos in Tocqueville. Come and eat free tacos and join in an informal conversation with our speakers and ask any questions you didn't get to tonight. And second, please come tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. in the Watkins Room, which is across the breezeway or across the hallway over there, for part 2 of Parties and Elections in America. We'll be hearing from Rui and also Tim Alberta of The Atlantic on American political parties and the changing presidential coalitions. So now let's show our appreciation to our speakers, and you are dismissed.